So we've been thinking about the general theme of leadership over the last few weeks, and this is partly in response to shocking revelations that came out some time ago now about Soul Survivor. And I want to just inform people who know nothing about this. Soul Survivor was the most significant Christian youth organization in this country. Thousands and thousands of teenagers went to Soul Survivor gatherings, and the music that came out of Soul Survivor was also very influential. It was led by a man called Mike Pilavachi, who has recently been found to have abused his position to persuade some young men to let him massage them, sometimes semi-naked. He also raised up successive young men, not young people, young men in leadership roles, especially worship leading, and then had a tendency to cast them aside if they upset him or if they got a girlfriend, and the closeness of his relationship was disrupted by that. Now, none of this is excusable, and many young people have been directly hurt or very confused as a result of this. Now, Mike and I lived together for a year when I was working in St Andrews, Chorleywood, and I would have considered him to have been a friend of mine. I saw none of these patterns of behavior when I knew him closely, but he was given to overworking, and he had a heart condition, and he kept two separate diaries so that people couldn't actually work out what he was doing. People tried to help him, particularly with this, but he didn't really want to be helped. He was a very warm-hearted man, a brilliant youth worker and evangelist, an exceptional leader of ministry in the power of the Spirit. Much later, after I moved on to other things, I talked to a couple of trustees out of concern for Mike, actually, because I knew, because I'd been told, that he was inappropriately relying on young guys for emotional support, and was concerned. I was concerned that there would be an explosion that would affect Mike and therefore the whole of Soul Survivor. I was told that this was just Mike, which is what people tended to say, and that everybody had tried to change him in various ways but without success, and I knew that. I knew nothing about the sexual misbehavior, and I was very shocked to hear about that when I did. What we've tried to do is introduce several policies as a church to regulate the way that we do life together and the way in which we lead, not least because we have lots of values in common with Soul Survivor. And we want to make sure that we're learning any lessons that we need to learn ourselves, and that the congregation of the church is safe from abusive behavior. I believe personally that this very sad situation should not be used to discredit the ministry that Mike led and the evangelistic efforts that Mike made as well. We have no intention of ceasing to pray for people in the power of the Spirit as we've always done, because the brokenness of one person has become tragically apparent. And without in any way condoning what Mike did, we should remember, all of us, that we are all jars of clay in which the Spirit dwells by his grace. Now, there are innumerable theories about what is the most important thing in Christian leadership, and some of my colleagues have sought to articulate what they understand by that. And then there's my theory, which is right. And so this is the most important thing about Christian leadership. It's knowing how to be led. Knowing how to be led is the most important thing. I took a team once to lead ministry to one of our friends' churches in Berlin, and I was hoping that God would speak to me through my devotional book, Bluey Blue Book, so called because it's blue and it's a book. And I was very deflated to read a series of verses literally about honoring your parents, not least because both of my parents had been dead for some time by this point, and I struggled to see any application whatsoever to my current situation. And that was very unusual, because often God has used this devotional book to help me. However, because this is not my first rodeo, I decided to reflect on these verses, and I felt God remind me that I'd actually walked myself a very long way away from the leadership of my parents. And initially I felt a kind of nostalgic twinge, and then I felt very glad. And the first session in Berlin was actually an informal discussion about leadership. And I discovered then that the former leader had stepped down and was now working as a teacher. His wife continued to lead the church, but he rarely attended. I was told that he'd had a midlife crisis which focused on unresolved aspects of his relationship with his father. His parents had apparently recently told this 45-year-old man and father of 2 kids that they had decided to let him go at the age of 45. Now, as Bob Dylan correctly observed, you've got to serve somebody, and equally, you will be led by somebody. You will be led by somebody. The leadership of our parents can leave long, and in some cases, painful legacies. There was a woman who came forward for prayer once, and after a service, and she said that she'd lived under judgment and couldn't look God in the face. She'd pleased her parents by becoming a missionary, then suffered burnout in her 30s, during which time she realized she hadn't got what her friends had, which was a husband and children, and so she got pregnant. And was then judged by her parents, with whom she was now living, and she couldn't pursue the career she wanted to pursue, apparently because she might fail in the eyes of her parents. And so she was living, I would suggest, as a true child of her parents. So again, it should go without saying that parental leadership can be contrary to aspects of our faith, of course, whether your parents are Christians or not Christians, and it can have a deeply destructive impact. Okay, if you're a child, stop looking at your parents. It's Father's Day. Yeah, stop it. Stop pointing. Anyway, so people do, however, allow this to shape and direct their lives long into adulthood. I watched a documentary this week about Trump and Stormy Daniels, and she described herself as a typical trailer trash from Texas. Her father made it clear to his wife that he did not want children, and she got pregnant anyway, and he then was totally uninterested in his daughter. He then proceeded to leave her mother, which broke her heart. From that moment onwards, nobody showed any interest in the person that became Stormy Daniels. She was sexually abused by a neighbor as a child, but she alone was not believed. At the time the documentary was made, she was on her 4th marriage. My point is that you rarely, if ever, find a woman who's been stripping since she was a teenager and working in the porn industry without this kind of catastrophic parental background story. I spoke to a young Christian guy who left home at 16. He told me that when he got off track, he needed God to give him a good slap so he could return to the right way. It turned out his father used to physically assault him on a regular basis and would do it for longer if he cried. He thinks crying is soft, it's not for men, and he doesn't like worship at all. I conducted the marriage of a woman that came to this church for many years. She was in her 60s at the time. Her father, on one occasion, shot at her with a gun when she was a teenager. He didn't come to the wedding service. Somehow she's still in a relationship with him. He didn't come to the wedding service, but he did attend the reception. He didn't, however, eat in the private room with all the rest of the wedding guests. He ate in the main restaurant. It has taken this woman years to find a reliable man to be with. Now, these are extreme examples, but can you identify any negative ways in which you are still, despite being an adult, very much subject to the leadership legacy of your parents? Shall I give you some common examples? These are common examples. Not being able to trust people, or not being able to trust God. Not really. Because of having had unsafe parents who were not trustworthy. Not experiencing intimacy with people. Not experiencing intimacy with God. Because that was never modeled at home. Having to work for acceptance or earn acceptance from people or from God because of the standards set by your parents. And yet, if you're a Christian, Jesus is your head, isn't he? Isn't Jesus your head? Do you want to check? Is Jesus your head? Well, no, I don't, whatever. I'm just saying, technically he is or he isn't. If you're behaving as though your parents are, something hasn't worked its way through, has it? The other leadership legacy that makes a considerable impact on people is the first church that shaped their beliefs about God. As Rod Stewart correctly observed, the first cut is the deepest. See, that's becoming less and less effective. As I get older, Rod's nearly dead, and etc. I spoke to a young woman who came occasionally to us, usually at the end, just to see her sister. She said, I really don't know why my sister goes to church. It turned out that they both suffered at the hands of a charismatic cult, and Sister 1 had actually courageously processed this. Sister 2 said the only time that she feels anxious in her life is when she goes near a church building, so why come? Because of subtle or not so subtle false theology, which we might have absorbed in our first cut church, we can struggle with things like, just check to see whether any of these things are you, because you won't have them enforced in St. Mary's. 1, being afraid of God. 2, question whether you're really loved by God. 3, have difficulty accepting grace or forgiveness from God. 4, have concerns about the work or the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But Jesus is our head, isn't he? Isn't Jesus our head? Just check again. So what does it mean to be led by God? I'll just read to you from the very famous Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. You are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So, in the analogy, which would have been very familiar to anybody way back then, of a shepherd and his sheep, the shepherd is very much the leader, and the sheep are very much the inane and only barely sentient followers. Sheep are on the same level as chickens. It's important to grasp the reality that sheep are stupid. When Jesus likens us to sheep, it is never a compliment. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Going astray, getting lost, getting stuck somewhere, becoming separated from the flock is what sheep regularly do. It's synonymous with being a sheep. They go to the same place in a field, even if it's covered by snow, because, hey, that's where they go, even if it means they're going to certain death. And if they fall over, they need help to get back on their tiny sheep-like hooves. The Good Shepherd's intention, though, is that inane and barely sentient sheep people like us shall not be in want. We shall lack for nothing. And I think what that means primarily is that we will not lack for connection with God. We will not lack for relationship with God. So he wants us to lie down in his presence in green pastures by still waters and be at rest. Green pastures, not barren wasteland which does not sustain. Still waters which are easy for a sheep to drink from. Can't drink from running waters. It's frightened of running waters. Lying down in God's presence. I did that physically for quite a while. For a long period of my time until I got a reclining chair, I prayed lying down. I quite like that because I'm lying down in God's presence. I used to practice lying down. I'm not sure how many of us have any clue how to rest or even create time to rest. Rest is essential. Do you know who lives longest? People who sleep during their life. It's true. Unless you're Italian, you drink red wine. It's one or the other. How often do we behave as though we're effectively harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd? When was the last time you were harassed and helpless, like a sheep, without a shepherd, as if you are without a shepherd? You were never without a shepherd. For one moment of your life, you were never shepherdless, ever. And yet, how often do we behave as though we've never met a shepherd? It's what sheep do. So what does the Good Shepherd do when he sees us in one of several predictable sheep-like states? Is he angry with us for failing him or getting stuck? Does he condemn us for not being in the right place or for having left the flock? No, he remembers that we are sheep and he has compassion on us. He knows what he's dealing with. Now, that doesn't justify the harm we do to ourselves when we do stupid things, but it is good to remember the heart of the shepherd who knows. He knows you. He knows you in your great glory and also in your profound weakness. He knows you and he loves you. The truth is that nothing of spiritual value happens through people unless we know how to lie down in the presence of God, just allowing ourselves to be ourselves in the presence of God and becoming aware, allowing ourselves to become aware of who God is. That's what it means to be in the presence of God. For you to allow yourself to be you and for you to allow God to be God. To be at rest in God's presence. I'm the vine, Jesus says, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Couldn't be simpler, really. Branches, when they're connected to the vine, they just produce fruit. It's not an effort for them. It's what happens. But we make things much more complex. Because at a mundane level, and we are inane and barely sentient, we're used to leading ourselves. If we actually believed in God, we would be desperate to be led by God. But because we struggle with faith, every one of us, there are at least areas of our lives where we actually think it'd be much, much better for us to lead our way out of this ourselves. Everybody. We're not used to being led by God, really. We want to bear fruit, don't we? Well, it's following that leads to bearing fruit. We want a restored soul, don't we? Well, God alone knows how to restore our soul, and this unfathomable, mysterious process only happens when we allow ourselves to be present to God at rest. The next element of being led by God is correction. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along right paths for his name's sake. So God guides us. He directs us. This does not mean terrifying rebuke. It means this is not the way, please stop walking in it, or this is the way, please walk in it, or you will hurt yourself. We can always ignore the voice of the Spirit in the heat of one passion or another, but it's always a mistake to do so because we will always suffer loss. Conversely, when we're connected to God, we're much more likely to want what God wants, and we become much more teachable as a result. It's all about connection with God. So we want the wisdom of God, don't we? We face so many situations where we need wisdom. Well, the truth is we only receive God's wisdom when we seek him, and that wisdom only helps us when we actually rely on the wisdom that he gives us. If somebody wants my advice at a much more mundane level, they have to arrange to see me, they have to make the time, they have to pay the extortionate amount of money, they have to ask me what I think, and they have to put into practice what they take from what I say. See how like God I am. Now, because I have known God for a long time, there are some things where I actually do have some quite useful things to say. For example, I'm good at questions about guilt or grief, anything beginning with G, basically. But people do have to seek me out to get my advice, and they have to trust what I say. God, in his wisdom, knew that I would need to be thinking about parental leadership in that day in Berlin. I would never, ever have worked that out for myself. God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. They only become our thoughts, they only become our ways as we lie down before God in his presence, in green pastures, by still waters, and rest. It's the only way they become ours. Protection is another aspect of being led by God. Verse 4, I will fear no evil, you are with me, your rod and staff comfort me. Your rod and staff comfort me. What does that mean? Because a shepherd's staff is for hitting things. Well, it's not that God hits us, it's that he bats off our enemies. That's the comfort. We probably have no idea how much protection we receive from God. God even wants us to sit down and enjoy rich food at a party with wonderful sheep company whilst our enemies are actually watching what's going on. Verse 5, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. God is able to taunt anything spiritual that's been sent against us when we are at peace in his presence. If you wish to lead, though, you will certainly be opposed. I repeat this story because I find it amusing. But the first time I ever went to Germany to teach about prayer, I was very young. I knew nothing. I came from the Midlands. Apologies to anyone that comes from the Midlands. I knew absolutely nothing at all about anything. I'd only eaten English food until about the age of 25. And for example, I didn't realize that you needed to get on a plane like earlier than it took off. I thought it was like a bus. So Julie went to the airport ready to get on the plane at the right time. Obviously, I was going to get there about 10 minutes early to be responsible. And it suddenly occurred to me, this is in the days before security or anything like that, it suddenly occurred to me this might not be right. So I asked a convenient air stewardess, am I right in thinking that you can just turn up and get on? She said, no, you need to turn up a bit earlier, and you'll have to become a runner. In those days, you had runners. So a runner was somebody that ran through the airport and hoped to get on the plane before the gate closed. So I became a runner. Now, just before I was due to get off the tube, and I'm now anxious to get going. I've got my suitcase, I'm ready to go. As always, it's oversized. I don't believe in leaving anything at home. And so it's quite heavy and big. And basically, this guy opposite me starts spitting on my suitcase. Then he gets out a metal bar and starts smacking it up and down on his hand and looking at me in a meaningful way. And so I am now pretty anxious, but I managed to get off the tube and, shoot in one direction. And, of course, I have chosen the wrong one. So I then have to shoot back past the guy who makes a play for my head with the metal bar like a ninja. I know it's slightly difficult to imagine now, but the level of fitness was so great in those days. I just went under the bar, and, and ended up just getting on the plane. Literally, somebody had traveled 4 hours to meet me in Germany. I could easily have missed it. Anyway, when I asked the Spirit to come in this group of people, it was mayhem. The power of God was so great at that time, it was incredible. But look at what nearly happened to me before I got there. I didn't really pay much attention at the time. I was young and foolish. Anyway, I also remember a life course, which is our evangelistic thing, during which we used to own this cottage. Our tenants just left during the course. We were dropped by our agency. I had a massive allergic reaction, which resulted in me being in hospital. Our dog died, and we were presented with a bill for $20,000, just like that, all during the course of the life course. None of that stopped God working in power. But it does make the point that sometimes we will be opposed. You want to be led, you'll be opposed. But you've got the Lord with his big shepherd stick knocking it off. Anything and everything can be thrown at us in some huge demonic roar, even our final enemy, death itself. Even though I walk through the darkest valley or the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. But no weapon formed against us will prosper because, and only because, God is with us. My mother's death was a tragedy for me and my family. It was deeply traumatic, but it was also what God used to totally establish my faith and my dependency upon God. I've been a Christian for a year. I knew times of great joy and total peace in the midst of everything because I threw myself upon God. I sought God's presence. I sought the comfort of God. And that made all the difference. And God taught me things which I've passed on ever since to people who've been bereaved. For example, I was crying one day and I was haunted by particular memories of my mother dying. And this voice spoke into my ear while I was crying and said, she's not stuck in a moment. And that really helped me. Because, once the suffering is ended, it's ended. They're not living it on a loop somewhere, right? So you don't have to. You don't have to continually think about how awful it would have been at that time when that happened to that person. It's over. Death ends it. I found that really comforting. As I said, I've shared that with lots of people who are hung up on particular memories of pain, the suffering of people they love, of course. And also, I have a reflection on guilt. I've noticed that people usually feel guilty about something when someone they love dies. And my theory is that is because very few things shatter the self-reliance and the self-denial of human beings about who they really are. But death is so shocking that it does. And for a moment, there is reality. I always think about Adrian Durham. I'll mention him at this time because he's a commentator on TalkSport who I really hated because he had one trick and one trick only, which is to hate Arsenal. And he just went on every single day. It was so boring. Anyway, The thing about Adrian Durham was, though, he hated Arsenal, but he loved England football. And at this time of year, he'd become like an excited puppy. And it didn't matter that decade after decade of failure had clearly washed up on our shores. And it didn't matter how great, it didn't matter. And there'd always be a moment when Adrian came to his senses. And after we had crashed out yet again, Adrian would start talking about the reality. And you could see, even Adrian was facing the football reality. And what I'm saying is, when somebody we love dies, we often are actually facing the reality of ourselves. And whenever we look within, in reality, because we are who we are, we're going to find something to feel guilty about. Because there's always evidence to convict us, because we are inane and sheep-like. So it's only then, though, that we're not in denial, really. But you know, guilt is guilt, and it's dealt with in one way only, which is by going to the cross. You can hold on to it for years and years and years. I once prayed for somebody who was tormented by the fact they hadn't tried to raise their husband from the dead for 17 years because they felt God immediately say he's dead. And they told their son that, and so the son stopped praying for him to be raised from the dead, and basically, he was dead. And then for 17 years, she was tormented by the fact that maybe she should have prayed for him to be raised from the dead. And I said, well, what do we do? You're a Christian, right? What do we do with guilt? Tell me. And she said, well, we confess it and God forgives us. So I said, well, should we do that then? And so 17 years ended right there. God can use anything if we allow ourselves to be ourselves and allow God to be present to us in it. If this is alien, it's because we haven't experienced much of this deep sense of connection with God that leaves us lying down in green pastures by still waters at rest. Otherwise, we would more readily return. Even when we're busy or stressed, instead, we try to get by in other ways, which means that though we survive, we suffer unnecessary loss. Consecration, I'm finishing now, is another aspect of God's leadership of us. You prepare a table with me in the presence of men, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Now, this being filled with the Spirit, this is how we are regularly filled with the Spirit. We don't wait for Sundays to come forward and be prayed for. We're filled with the Spirit when we come into the presence of God. This is how we're filled with the Spirit on a daily basis. So we need that. Otherwise, we ain't going to be filled with the Spirit. If we're not filled with the Spirit, we can't do very much. How did Jesus do what he did? How was Jesus led? I believe the explanation can best be found at his baptism, where the veil is removed. We have a direct account of what happened from Jesus himself. He was baptized to establish the pattern of doing what was right. He was affirmed by the voice of his Father. He was filled with the Spirit without limit. He did not do what he did simply because he was the Son of God. In the incarnation, he laid aside various divine attributes like being all-powerful and being everywhere at once. He shows us what a sinless human being can do when they are deeply connected to their Father, perfectly obedient to him, and filled with the Spirit without limit. Jesus is our model, and he's not our model. We are never perfectly going to do the things Jesus did because of our sinfulness. Jesus was sinless. But insofar as we dwell in the presence of our Father, believe in his love for us, seek to be obedient to him, insofar as we're filled and anointed by the Spirit, God will use us to do wonderful things. But there isn't another way. If you want to lead, you need to submit, first of all, to being led on a daily basis. So process the pain you carry, especially around coming near to God as Father, or just near to God in general. Being able to be in his presence at peace with him. Process anything which stops that. Process any caution about the Spirit, especially about the gifts of the Spirit, because you need those flipping things to be of any use. Process active disobedience in your life right now, where you're doing something which you know God does not want you to do, or same kind of thing, where God has actually tried to lead you somewhere and you have refused to go, which is quite common. Process any sense of failure, because when we are aware of having failed, we do not naturally look into the face of God. We look away from the face of God, and that short circuits the whole process of being used to lead. So now we get an opportunity to process these things with God, you lucky, lucky people. Let's stand.